Under the blistering Florida sun, where the land rolled flat and dry like God had run out of ink halfway through creation, Jedediah Jed Stone rode slow across the palmetto scrublands. His dun mare, Dusty, moved with the weary rhythm of an old soul. It had been 5 hours since he lost the calf's trail, its prints washed soft by last night's rain. But Jed kept going, not for the calf, not really. It was the quiet he chased, the kind of quiet that let ghosts keep their distance. The sky was a hard blue, the air heavy with iron and memory. If you love cowboy love stories with danger, redemption, and a little bit of mystery, drop a 1 in the comments and stay close. This is Wild West Love. A sound broke the stillness, small, wet, not animal, not wind. Jed stopped. His boots creaked as he leaned forward, squinting toward the distant fence line. 3 strands of rust-bitten barbed wire stretching across a patch of open field like an old wound. Then he heard it again, a whimper, thin and sharp, like a child trying not to cry. He slid down from the saddle, tied Dusty's reins to a dead pine root, and unslung his rifle. His heart slowed the way it used to before a gunfight measured. Deliberate, he moved through the sawgrass and sandspur barefoot to soften the noise. The ground was hot enough to blister. There, between 2 leaning posts, he saw her, a young woman, slung stomach down across the barbed wire like an offering. Her wrists were bound tight with rough hemp, pulled wide and cruel between 2 wooden stakes, her arms stretched like a crucifix. Her back was torn in several places where the barbs had bitten deep jagged wounds kissed by sun and flies. Her skin, the color of dark river clay, shimmered with sweat and blood. A strip of burlap cloth was tied across her eyes, already soaked and dark at the center. Jed's breath caught in his throat. Above her, nailed to the middle post, hung a wooden board smeared in red. The whites call it progress, not a name, not a charge, a sentence. He stepped back, bile rising. The sign felt personal, like it had been meant for him too. The wind kicked up, whispering through the grass like a warning from the dead. Jesus, Jed muttered, hand tightening around his rifle. The girl groaned a broken, low sound that stopped him cold. That sound didn't belong to an enemy or an outlaw. That sound belonged to the half-alive. "I'm coming," he whispered, low but firm. "Don't move. I got you." He slung the rifle and pulled the knife from his belt. Carefully, he stepped toward her, talking as he moved. "You ain't alone now, you hear me? I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't speak, just breathed, shallow and strained. His fingers trembled barely, but enough for him to notice. Not fear, not now. But rage, slow and cold, curling deep in his gut like a coiled snake. The hemp left angry red welts around her wrists, some cut to raw meat. She didn't cry out, only shuddered when his knuckles brushed her blood-slicked skin. He swallowed hard. She weighed nothing, and yet her silence was heavier than anything he'd carried since the war. Jedediah Jed Stone dropped to one knee beside the young woman draped across the barbed wire. Her body hung limp, wrists bound tight with hemp rope, blood seeping where the rusted barbs had bitten deep. The sign above her head read, "The whites call it progress." The letters smeared in fresh crimson, glistening like a curse in the sun. The wind curled hot around them, dragging with it the metallic scent of blood, sweat, and something that smelled like punishment. Jed's pulse slowed the way it always did before a gunfight, but his hands moved fast, his eyes scanning the damage, jaw locked tight. The barbs had done more than tear skin. They had left shame, branding, history. "Hold on," he whispered, low and calm, like he was trying to soothe a wild colt. "I'm getting you free." He slid the blade under the first rope, careful not to tug. The strands resisted, stiff with dried blood. As the hemp gave way, her arm twitched, a flinch born of instinct. Her breath came out in a hiss, barely audible, and her head lolled sideways. He repositioned, cutting the second rope. Each stroke felt too slow, each second too long. The final strand snapped, and her body slumped forward like a puppet whose strings had been severed. Jed caught her just in time, his arms slipping around her before she fell fully into the wire. The barbs still clung to her shirt, to her skin, but he eased her away, lifting gently. The flies rose in a furious buzz, disturbed from their feast. Jed ignored them. Her skin burned against his forearm, fevered and raw, but still alive. He'd seen death clean, fast, cruel, but this was something worse. This was what happened when men made themselves gods. When he removed the blindfold, her eyes stayed closed at first. Then, slowly, one lid lifted, dark brown eyes, rimmed with red. They flicked to his face, then away. He said gently, "You don't need to talk. Just breathe." She blinked once, twice. Her lashes fluttered like broken wings. The sun hit her face, and for a second she flinched, then looked straight at him. No thanks, no fear, just a question heavy as thunder. Why? Jed didn't flinch. He didn't have an answer. Only this truth. Some things you don't walk away from. Some names you don't let them carve into a woman's skin. He nodded once, slow. That sign is not true. He knelt beside her, pulled out a canteen, and poured water onto a square of cloth. He touched it to her lips. She flinched. "It's clean," he said, almost pleading. She opened her mouth slightly, enough to let the damp cloth pass. Her throat moved as she swallowed. That was when he noticed her age. Young, maybe 20. But her back told a different story. Scarred in a way no girl her age should have carried. The lines crisscrossed like she'd been caught between fire and time. "You Seminole?" he asked softly. Her brow twitched. No answer. "I figured." The cypress necklace gave it away. Around her neck was a single carved bead shaped like a teardrop. He looked again at the sign. The words. The blood. "They think you were helping someone," he murmured. "Or maybe you just scared them." A breath escaped her lips. "Not quite a sob. Not yet." He wrapped his coat around her and lifted her in both arms. She was light, too light. Her body folded into his arms like she'd been meant to fit their bones, too sharp beneath heat-burned skin, breath hitching against his collar. She was burning up. Fever. Or maybe the sun had scorched her through. Jed shifted her slightly, careful not to press the wounds on her back. Her hair smelled of sweat, salt, and blood, matted in clumps. One scarred hand twitched against his chest, fingers curling instinctively in the fabric of his shirt, a wordless plea not to let go. Skin warm like fevered metal under sun. Her head lolled against his shoulder. Jed's boots sank into the sand with each step toward Dusty, his dun mare tied to a gnarled pine root. The air shimmered around them, waves of heat distorting the distance. The saddle creaked as they approached, the only sound besides the thud of his heart. He shifted her weight, hoisting her gently into the saddle. Her legs slid across the worn leather, limp but obedient. Her fingers twitched, curling weakly around the pommel. Jed reached for his coat, draping it across her back, shielding the wounds from the searing sun. Then he tugged the blindfold loose. Her eyes opened slowly, dark, rimmed red, fierce even through pain. She stared at him without speaking, and something in that stare hit him harder than any bullet ever had. "I'm Jed," he said softly, looping a quick knot around her waist to secure her to the saddle. "We're getting out of here." He swung up behind her, the warmth of her body pressing into his chest. His arms circled around her, fingers gripping the reins. Her breath, shallow but steady, mixed with his in the heavy air. "Hold tight," he murmured, his lips near her ear, a prayer wrapped in a command. With a nudge of his heels, Dusty surged forward, hooves thudding against the dry earth, carrying them away from barbed wire, from judgment, into the wild hush of scrubland and chance. Her lips parted, parched and trembling, as his coat brushed her skin-coarse wool over open wounds. She didn't cry, not once, but when he pulled the blindfold off, and her eyes met his, there was no mistaking the plea buried inside that gaze. "Don't leave me here," and he couldn't. Her fingers, though cracked and bloodied, reached weakly for the saddle horn. He caught them gently, one by one, guiding them forward. "You're safe now," he whispered, though he wasn't sure it was true. He gritted his teeth. "I got you," he muttered, more to himself than her. "Ain't nobody gonna take you down again." Zebrua. Back at the ranch 12 miles south, tucked behind a line of longleaf pines, Jed eased her down onto a cot, brushing away the dust and old nails with his sleeve. The small house was quiet. One bed, one chair, one pot still hanging over a dead fire. He'd lived here 6 years, mostly with silence for company. Now it felt different. He cleaned her wounds slowly. Warm water, soft cloth, bandages cut from old flannel. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just watched him. Her eyes were clear now, though rimmed with mistrust. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Nothing." He reached for the cloth again, dipped it in the basin. "I ain't one of them," he said. "I've seen what they do to your people. I don't agree with it." Still, no answer, just breath and stare. "You don't believe me," he said. "Can't blame you." He paused, then added quietly, "Once, I stood by and watched a girl I knew get taken. They said she was hiding runaways. I didn't say a word. I just stood there like a coward." He wrung the cloth again, eyes low. "Never forgave myself for that." He looked up and her eyes were on him now. Not just looking, reading. A flicker passed between them, not forgiveness, but something that lived next door to it. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but all that came was a whisper, "Why?" Jed set the cloth down. "Why'd I help you?" She nodded once, slow. He ran a hand over his jaw, rough with 4-day stubble. Then he spoke. "'Cause no one did for her. And 'cause I ain't made of stone, not all the way." She didn't smile, but she closed her eyes. For the first time, the muscles in her brow loosened. Jed sat back in the chair and watched her breathe, watched the tremble fade from her hands. He didn't ask more questions. He didn't need to. Not yet. Because sometimes, the quiet between two people says more than words ever could. The next morning broke slow and gray, the kind of light that feels like it borrowed its shine from ash. Fog hung low along the tree line, drifting through the pines like something half-living, and the dew on the porch rail glistened cold and slick beneath Jed's hand. Inside, the girl still silent, still watching lay, wrapped in his old cavalry coat, the brown wool swallowing her frame. She hadn't spoken again, but she'd taken 2 spoonfuls of beans the night before, and when he'd left the room, she'd pulled the blanket up herself. That, Jed figured, counted for something. He poured black coffee into an enamel tin, the surface rippling like oil. He sipped, bitter and hot. The porch creaked under his boots. Out here, quiet had a weight to it. It pressed down on you, reminded you what you'd done and what you hadn't. The birds hadn't sung yet. That's when the sound came, hoofbeats. Distant at first, then sharper. Jed didn't panic. He set the cup down slow and walked to the corner of the porch where the rifle leaned, half hidden behind a crate of feed. His fingers closed around the worn walnut stock, just as a chestnut mare emerged from the mist, steam curling from her nostrils like smoke from a fresh-lit fuse. The rider was tall, lean, wearing blue cavalry wool, with gold braid dulled by time and dust. His hat sat low, shadowing a clean-shaven jaw and sun-hardened eyes. The badge on his chest caught what little light the day offered. "Jedediah Stone?" the man asked, reining in the horse 10 paces from the porch. Jed nodded once. "Who's askin'?" "Lieutenant Thomas Graham, Fort Hale." Jed kept his voice even. "That place still standin'. Thought the termites took it by now." The lieutenant didn't smile. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and handed it down. Jed stepped forward slowly. The rifle stayed loose at his side, but his thumb found the safety just the same. He unfolded the paper. A sketch-roof charcoal, no name just. Wanted. For aiding and abetting fugitive slaves. Violent. Last seen near Cotton Creek. Seminole descent. His throat went dry. "You seen her?" Graham asked. Jed took longer than he needed to study the page, then looked up. "Can't say I have." The lieutenant tilted his head. "You sure?" Jed lit a beat pass. "Only girl been round here lately is my mule. She's got a kick like Judgment Day and a better attitude than most folks I meet." That earned him the ghost of a smirk. Inside, behind the thin wooden wall, Naya crouched in the shadow of the corner, wrapped tight in the coat. Her bare feet curled under her, silent, unmoving, the same way animals go still when they sense the hunter's breath nearby. She had heard every word. Her heart beat slow and deep in her chest, like a war drum underwater. Lieutenant Graham adjusted in the saddle, not quite relaxing. "Mind if I have a look around?" Jed shook his head. "I do mind." The silence crackled. "I got no warrant if that's what you're waiting to hear," the soldier admitted. Jed took a half step forward. "Then I reckon here's the end of the conversation." For a long second, neither man moved. Then Graham exhaled through his nose and tapped the reins. "Well, if you do see anything strange, you know where to find us. Jed nodded once, slow. Strange don't tend to announce itself. The lieutenant turned the horse. Dust kicked behind him as he rode away, swallowed fast by the mist. Jed watched until even the hoofbeats were gone. He stood there a while longer, breathing steady. Then he turned and went inside. Naya was still crouched, her eyes locked on his, wide but dry. She looked like a question that didn't know how to ask itself. "You heard all that?" he asked quietly. She nodded. Jed walked past her, poured a ladle of water from the barrel into the basin, washed his hands slow. The air in the cabin had changed, no longer just quiet, but taut, humming with something unsaid. "I lied for you," he said simply. She didn't move. "They think you're dangerous, that you stirred up trouble, helped folks run." Still, she said nothing. Jed dried his hands, then sat down across from her at the small table, one chair between them, worn smooth from years of disuse. "I'm not asking if it's true," he said, "and I ain't sending you back. But I need to know where they comin'. Will more follow?" Naya's lips parted, just slightly, then closed again. She looked down at her hands, bandaged and still swollen. Her fingers were long, fine-boned, like someone who once played an instrument or painted symbols on tent hides. Then, quietly like leaves rustling after the storm has passed, she said, "They never stop." Jed exhaled through his nose. "Didn't think so." Dash. Another beat. Then, to his surprise, her voice came again, rough but clear. "Why? Why what? Why lie?" Her gaze held him now, direct, strong, not pleading, just searching. He took a moment before answering. "Because no one lies for the ones who need it most." That hit somewhere between her ribs. He could see it in her posture, a softness that hadn't been there before. She looked away, whispered, "They called me a slave harborer, like it was a curse." Jed's jaw worked tight. "They call a lot of things a curse. Freedom's always near the top of the list." Silence again, but this one was warmer. Something had shifted. Jed stood, fetched the blanket from the cot, and held it out. She didn't reach for it, but she didn't flinch when he draped it over her shoulders either. "You stay here as long as you need," he said. "And if they come again?" she asked. He looked her square in the eye. "Then I'll stand in front of the door." "No." A silence settled between them, thicker than fear, softer than trust, something in between, like a thread pulled taut, not yet broken. Outside, the fog lifted. A bird called from the pine. The sun, shy and slow, began to pierce the gray. Inside the little cabin, a girl who had nearly died on barbed wire and a man who had once stood still while someone else suffered sat under the same roof, bound now by something more dangerous than blood. Hope. The third day came cloaked in heat, thick and pressing, as if the air itself had been poured in from a boiling kettle. The clouds above hung low and bruised, the sky the color of old pewter, and not even the cicadas dared to hum. Out beyond the yard, the swampland whispered sawgrass brushing together in breathless rhythms, cypress knees jutting like forgotten bones from the mud. Jed had lived on the edge of this land for nearly a decade and never seen it sit so still. Inside, the little cabin exhaled the scent of old smoke and sweat-soaked linen. Naya hadn't spoken since the lieutenant's visit, but something about her movements had changed. They were quieter, yes, but not timid, deliberate, like someone who had learned to glide through shadow without making enemies of it. Jed noticed. She no longer flinched when the floorboards creaked under his boots, no longer turned away when his hands got too close. She had started rearranging things when he was out, a pot placed back on the right hook, a tin cup scrubbed and upturned, a bundle of moss she'd set on the sill to dry like some quiet offering to the light. But it wasn't until Jed returned from cutting firewood that he saw it, the drawing. He froze just inside the door, sweat running rivers down his neck, his shirt clinging to his back like a second skin. The old tin basin had been pulled to the center of the floor, and beside it, in the dust, she had traced something with the end of a stick. A cypress tree, tall and narrow, its roots twisted in fire-sharp black lines for flames curling at the base. And beside it, half submerged in shadow, the long slither of a water moccasin, mouth open, fangs exposed not in menace, but in motion, like it was leaving, escaping. Naya knelt beside the image, one hand still holding the stick, the other pressed lightly to her abdomen as if to steady herself. Her face, normally still as stone, was alive now, eyes wide, jaw tight, and beneath the collar of his old shirt, her pulse beat fast at the hollow of her throat. Jed set the axe down slowly, careful not to disturb the moment. "That your people's sign?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. Her hand moved, brushing a line across the snake's tail. "In the swamp," she began, voice rough like gravel in creek water. "The trees bend to survive. You know that?" Jed nodded once, slow. "They break and bend and break again." She glanced at him. "But they don't fall. The roots go deep, under fire, under flood. We draw the cypress to remember that." She touched the flames beneath the tree. "And this?" Her voice dropped lower. "What they did." Jed stepped closer, boots careful in the dust. He saw how her knuckles had scraped raw from kneeling too long. The stick in her hand trembled. He said nothing. So she continued, words falling like loose stones down a long, echoing shaft. "My father was a runner. Not the kind with shoes, but the kind with maps inside his head. He helped guide people through the backwaters, deep into the gladesmen, women, children, some black, some Seminole, some mixed. None of them wanted. Len." Jed squatted beside her, not touching, just close enough to hear every breath. "We took them in," she said, "built huts on platforms above the gators, grew rice in flooded ground. They said we were rebels, traitors, slave thieves." She drew a line through the tree. "One night they came. No flag, no warning, just torches." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "They burned the huts, shot old men in their hammocks. My uncle died with a knife in his teeth. My little cousin, Shesh, tried to run, but they—" Jed reached out, not to touch her, but to plant his hand palm flat in the dust beside the snake. It was enough. She steadied. "They caught me," she whispered. "Dragged me to their camp, said I was hiding rebels, said I'd talk, but I didn't." Jed's jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek pulling hard like it remembered its own story. "So they did worse," Naya said. Her fingers gripped the stick harder now. "They beat me, tied me to a pine for a night, left me with no water. Next day, they wrapped wire around my wrists and laid me over that fence like a slaughtered deer." Her voice dropped. "That's how you found me." Jed swallowed hard, the taste of copper rising in his mouth. He looked at her, really looked. The ridges on her arms, the bruising on her hips, the haunted way she sometimes stared at walls like they might turn into faces. "You should have let me die," she said. Jed answered instantly. "You don't know what they'll do if they catch me again." "They'll have to catch me first," he said. Naya's eyes met his. For the first time, she didn't look away. "You're not like them," she said, as if tasting the words. "I was," Jed replied. "Once, I wore the same blue coat, stood with them when they came for the villages. I told myself I was just following orders." He looked down at the dirt drawing. "Then one day they hung a boy no older than 12. Said he was a scout. He just had a map drawn in charcoal on his skin." Naja's lips parted. "I left that night," Jed said. "Rode west, burned the uniform, never picked a side again. Until now." Silence pooled between them, thick, not empty, full of everything neither had said aloud until this very moment. Then she leaned forward, pressed her fingers to the snake's mouth, wiped it away. Jed tilted his head. "Why'd you do that?" She didn't answer right away. Then quietly she said, "Because it's not running anymore." He watched her fingers. They were rough, scabbed, but graceful, strong. "I'm tired of running." Jed stood, held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then, without hesitation, took it. As he pulled her up, she stumbled slightly, the weight of memory making her legs slow. He steadied her. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere deep, far off over the glades, but the air had shifted. Something inside had broken, and something else had begun. The sun hadn't yet breached the ridge, but the world was already on fire. Not from flames, not yet, but from the quiet before them. Jed felt it first, long before he saw anything. A tightness in the air, like a breath held too long. The forest was too quiet, even for dawn. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels, just the wet hush of fog rolling low over the pine needles, thick as poured milk, curling around roots and stumps like it had business of its own. He loaded the rifle in silence, every click of metal sharp against the stillness. Naya was by the hearth, braiding her thick black hair down her back with fingers fast but calm, her movements trained and sure, the kind that came from a childhood of running at sunrise and hiding by twilight. She'd wrapped her feet in strips of cotton and tied the edges with deer hide, the soles worn smooth from swampland and secrets. Jed watched her from the corner of his eye. He didn't have to say it. She already knew. "They're coming," she said flatly, eyes on the window. Jed nodded once. 3 riders, maybe 4, saw the trail a mile out, hoofprints fresh as spilled whiskey. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stood and grabbed the flint knife from the mantel, slipped it into the sash of her waist. "What do we do?" she asked. Jed turned toward her, the rifle heavy in his arms. "We don't wait." They slipped out the back like shadows, the frost-tipped grass crackling faintly beneath their steps. Jed led her through the thicket behind the cabin, an old deer path he'd cleared years ago, long since grown wild again. Branches clawed at their sleeves like jealous hands, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. The woods opened into a wide gully lined with fallen pine and ghost-gray moss, swaying like tattered flags. They crouched beneath the lip of the ravine, breath fogging in the cold, hearts beating louder than the rustling wind. Then hoofbeats, faint at first, but unmistakable, and a whistle. Short, sharp, military. Jed cursed under his breath. Union scout. Naya's face had gone still again. Not from fear, never fear, but focus, the way water stills before it floods. She turned to him suddenly. "Jed, if they catch me, they won't." "But if," I said, "they won't." Though. His voice cracked like a whip, harsher than he meant it, but she didn't pull away. She just looked at him. Her face was streaked with sweat and sap, a cut on her cheek barely crusted over, eyes bright and fierce and impossibly steady. "Don't throw your life away for me," she whispered. Jed looked down at her, hands dirty, scarred, fingers calloused from weaving traps and feeding fire ant, reached for them. "I already did," he said. They didn't kiss. There wasn't time for softness, only for running. They tore through the underbrush, branches clawing their coats, roots grabbing ankles like the forest itself wanted to hold them. A shot cracked behind them, then another. Bark exploded above Naya's head, raining down splinters. She didn't scream. She just kept running. They reached the riverbank by midday, lungs burning, feet raw. The old wooden ferry Jed had once tied up was half sunken, but still floating. He shoved it off with his shoulder, half dragged her aboard, and they pushed into the current, hearts thundering louder than the water. Naya collapsed on the deck, arms trembling, but eyes still sharp. Jed kept watch with the rifle slung low, scanning the tree line for riders. Then movement. Figures in blue. Muskets raised. The first bullet hit the river, kicking up a geyser of muddy water. The second tore through the sail rope, sending the canvas flapping like a wounded bird. Jed shouted, "Down!" But Naya was already crawling toward him, grabbing his coat. "Take cover!" They rolled behind a crate of old flour sacks, just as another bullet slammed into the wood beside them, sending a spray of splinters across Jed's arm. He gritted his teeth. Blood dripped down his sleeve like red ink. "You're hit," she gasped. "I've had worse." The river bent sharp to the left, trees growing denser along the edge, a natural blind. If they could make it past the bend. Then came a shriek. Animal, high-pitched. Their horse, tied to the rear of the raft, bucked wildly as a bullet clipped its haunch. It thrashed, eyes rolling back, and with a final cry, tore loose and vanished into the brush, leaving behind a trail of blood and broken branches. Jed cursed under his breath, gripping the oar tighter. "We're exposed now." But Naya didn't look afraid. She looked furious. I'm not dying here, she spat, crawling to the edge of the ferry. Jed grabbed her wrist. What are you doing? She pointed toward the bank. There's a switchgrass tunnel. Leads to the old Seminole pit. My father built it. They'll never find us there. Jed looked at her, saw the steel in her bones, the fire behind her sweat-slick brow. He nodded. Go. She jumped, landing with a splash that swallowed her whole. He followed a breath later. The water was freezing, full of leeches and ghosts, but it wrapped them in silence. Bullets stopped. The world muffled. They surfaced inside the reed tunnel, gasping, eyes wide, soaked to the bone, but alive. And for the first time since it all began, Naya smiled. Not wide, not loud, but real. Jed saw it and smiled back, bloody, breathless, and soaked in mud but somehow whole. Then she grabbed his hand and pulled him into the shadows. Behind them, the river carried the empty ferry downstream, and far above, through a crack in the trees, sunlight fell in slanted shards, sharp as memory, soft as hope. The woods held their breath. Not the kind of hush that follows a prayer or a funeral, but something thicker, something that clung to the back of the throat like the soot after a house fire. It was the silence that comes after choices are made and can't be taken back. Jed leaned against the rough bark of a poplar tree, one hand pressed to the ragged wound on his shoulder where the bullet had kissed bone. Blood soaked through his shirt in wide rust-colored blotches, drying like a map of loss across his chest. Each breath came short, shallow, like the air itself was too heavy to lift. But he didn't cry out, didn't want, because Naya was still alive, and that made everything else tolerable. She crouched beside him, the dim firelight flickering across her face, casting shadows beneath her cheekbones like war paint. Her hair, still damp from the river, clung in strands to her neck, and there was a kind of feral grace in her now like a panther that had once known the cage and vowed never to taste steel again. You shouldn't have followed me, she whispered, voice low, thick with something too old to name. Jed laughed, and it was a jagged thing. You think I'd stay behind and let some wet behind-the-ears lieutenant take you back in chains? You're bleeding. Hell, darlin', I've been bleeding since the day I met you. She looked down at him sharply, but her lips didn't move. He watched her fingers strong, quick, weathered tie off the bandage, with a knot that bit into flesh, and he didn't flinch. The pain kept him conscious. The ache kept him tethered to her, to now, to the strange lull between danger and deliverance. They had holed up in the remnants of an old trapper's hut, half buried in ivy and rot, nestled deep in the hills where the moss hung heavy and the wind whispered stories in tongues only the dead remembered. Naya had found Eat, of course she had. The earth knew her like a mother knows the gait of her child, and it gave her cover when she needed it most. Outside, the moon rose heavy and swollen, bleeding white through the cracks in the slats. Inside, time dripped slow. He wanted to tell her everything, that her laugh had once pulled him back from the edge after his brother died, that the way she never apologized for the dirt beneath her nails made him believe in something raw and holy, that her silence, even in rage, was louder than any battlefield drum. But he didn't say any of it, because sometimes, when a man's got nothing left but his words, he learns which ones are worth swallowing. Instead, he asked, "Do you still have it?" She blinked. "What?" "The coin," he rasped, smiling faintly. "The one I gave you after that shootout in Del Rio. Said it was lucky. You said it was cursed." Naya didn't smile, but her eyes did. She reached into the pocket of her worn hide jacket, pulled out the tarnished silver coin, and held it up to the light. "Been with me ever since," she said softly. "That's why we're still breathing." "There." "No," she said, brushing the hair from his brow with the gentleness of rain. "That's because you're too damn stubborn to die." He caught her wrist before she could pull away. "I ain't got much left in me, Naya. Don't say that. I need you to listen." She froze. "I need you to go. Alone. Number. They'll be looking for 2, not 1. You head south, cut through the chaparral. There's a man in Laredo Esquivel. Tell him I sent you. He'll keep you safe, get you to Mexico. Men. And what about you? I'll lead him the other way. Number. I'll buy you time. Number." Her voice cracked like glass under boot. "I won't let you do this," she said. Jed smiled soft, crooked, the way a dying man smiles when the pain's finally quieter than the fear. You already have. Then he stood, not easily, not clean, but with the kind of resolve that roots itself in marrow, not muscle. He strapped the rifle to his back, knowing he wouldn't fire it again, slipped the coin into her hand and closed her fingers around it, slow and steady. I want you to live, he said, not hide. She shook her head, eyes burning. I want you, she whispered. With me. He didn't answer at first, just looked at her like a man might look at the horizon, knowing it's beautiful but unreachable. There was something shattered in his eyes but not broken. No. Jed was the kind of man who didn't break. He bent like old pine in winter storms, cracking but standing, bleeding but walking. I used to dream of this, he said, voice low and hoarse. You, me, somewhere quiet. No sheriffs, no warrants, no shadows breathing down our necks. Then why not now? Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of almost having something only to lose it again. He reached up, touched the edge of her jaw with the back of his fingers, like he was afraid she might dissolve under his touch. Because men like me carry storms in their pockets. And you, he swallowed hard, you deserve sun. Her breath hitched. I never asked for the sun, I asked for you. And he stopped, forced himself to keep looking in her eyes. I can't be the reason they bury you in some unmarked grave. Not after everything. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, a dry rustle, like bones shifting under leaves. The forest was listening. Naya took his hand, placed it over her heart. You feel that? She said. That's yours. It's always been. And for a moment, Jed didn't feel the blood loss or the pain. He just felt her warm, defiant, alive. He memorized the curve of her cheek, the shape of her lashes when they trembled, the scent of damp earth and river water in her hair. He knew he'd carry that with him wherever he ended. Promise me, she said suddenly, grabbing his wrist with fierce fingers. If you make it out, you come find me. No more disappearing. No more letters I never receive. He nodded, slow and solemn. Cross my heart. And if you die? Her voice broke. He smiled. Not cruel, not resigned, just soft. Then I'll haunt every man who ever raised a hand to you. I'll ride the wind and spit in their goddamn whiskey. She laughed, choking on it like a sob. And then, without warning, she pulled him close, pressed her face into the curve of his neck like she was trying to breathe him into her bones. He held her, arms trembling from the strain, from the knowing. This was no lover's embrace, it was something older, raw, like a farewell carved into flesh. He leaned close, their foreheads brushing, the world tilting around that one trembling point of contact. I was never meant for peace, he said. But you were meant for something more than gunpowder and ghosts. Jed, she whispered. Yeah? I hate you for making me love you like this. I know, he said, voice cracking. Me too. They stayed like that for seconds that tasted like hours. Every heartbeat a drumbeat in a war neither of them could win. When she pulled away, it was like peeling skin from skin. He stepped back, 1 pace, 2, still watching her, still wanting to fall to his knees and beg the world to be different. But men like Jed had already asked too much of the world. So he turned, and the door closed behind him with a sound like a gunshot. Out the door, into the night, footsteps swallowed by pine needles and fate. She stayed crouched by the fire for a long time, fists clenched so tight the coin left an imprint on her palm, hot as iron. Far off, gunshots echoed. 3. Then silence. Not the kind that follows a storm, but the kind that makes one.